All right, well, we got to start here. And I think this question might take us a little bit longer than some others, but tell us how you became a Christian.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Well, Australia, as you probably know and your audience probably know, is actually quite a secular country. And I grew up in a completely sort of non-Christian home. And I had, however, always kind of wanted to be a historian from about the age of 9. But sort of the path to Christianity actually didn't really begin until I was at university, actually at grad school, at the University of Cambridge and then at the University of Oxford. And basically what happened was that I began to have experiences that, well, first of all, kind of unpicked all the kind of simple caricatures that I'd held about Christianity. I mean, I'd basically kind of grown up secular household, but also somebody who was an intellectual and a budding academic, somebody who thought that Christianity was particularly sort of anti-intellectual. And one of the first things that happened actually was when I was an undergraduate at the University of Cambridge, I was reading for my PhD thesis, 17th century, we now call these guys natural philosophers, and they're really the founders of modern science. These are people like Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry, Robert Hooke, one of the founders of the modern experiment, Isaac Newton, some really well-known names. And the first thing that really happened was that it struck me that they took their faith incredibly seriously. And what at first I just kind of dismissed as window dressing, I had to kind of recognize was entirely, I mean, not just compatible with the way they were thinking about their scientific work, but actually that their theology was at the very heart of it. I mean, I remember one day I was reading Robert Boyle's work, and this is a disquisition on experimental philosophy in the 1600s, right? And he's quoting Psalm 8. And I remember just sort of thinking to myself how, well, just wondering how it is that he could kind of reconcile what I thought was a kind of inherent tension, right, between Christianity and science. I guess that's the first thing. It didn't make me a Christian or anything, but it began to unpick that kind of caricature I'd held of Christians. But then really one of the major things that happened was that when I was a junior research fellow, this is a kind of postdoctoral research fellowship that I had at the University of Oxford, some friends and I heard that one of the famous philosophers, atheist philosophers, Peter Singer, who's very well known, he's sort of like the Richard Dawkins in the sort of atheist philosophy world, was coming to give a series of lectures at the University of Oxford on ethics. And I kind of went along with some of my friends thinking that Singer's lectures would kind of just be really encouraging to me and kind of just affirm all the kind of atheist convictions I had about ethics. But actually what I heard almost pulled the carpet from beneath my feet. It's kind of left me, I've used this phrase like intellectual vertigo, because that's what it was. Because basically what happened is that I sort of expected that Singer would affirm ideas that I'd always kind of held to be some of my deepest moral intuitions, for example, about the value of human life, that I had always kind of assumed were compatible with atheism. But actually what Singer made quite clear, because he is an atheist, right, is that there is no inherent value or even sort of sense of the equal value of human life. And I kind of went back and read Singer's work, a lot of his philosophical work, and that also contributed to this kind of unraveling, I suppose, of my atheism. And I kind of think that's quite funny in a way, because today, we tend in the Christian world to kind of go through this period of hearing about a lot of people who like deconstruct their faith, right? But actually what happened to me was I kind of deconstructed my atheism. God made me deconstruct my atheism. And so anyway, so reading about Peter Singer's work and basically coming to realize that my deepest moral intuitions, the things I thought were most important about human life, its equal value and its dignity, were actually not able to be sustained by atheism at all. But again, it doesn't make me a Christian, but it kind of leaves me questioning. And then one kind of lonely winter in Oxford where I'd sort of remained in Oxford, all my friends had kind of gone home, I hadn't gone back to Australia that winter. I was sitting in the library and I realized that the desk that I always sat at was in front of the theology section. And to be honest, I still was too reticent even to pick up a Bible. But I picked up a book of sermons, and I think I'd basically been wondering whether or not there was actually anything to this. And sort of, in my arrogance, always growing up, I'd sort of dismissed Christianity. But when I began to read these sermons, I was given a glimpse of a profoundly rich picture of who humanity is and what this story is of a God who is in the process of redeeming this broken world and this broken humanity that was far deeper than I'd ever thought had anything to do with Christianity. And that just, I remember, so for example, in one of the sermons talked about Psalm 139, which is the psalm in which the psalmist is talking about God fashioning me within my mother's womb and giving me basically this completely different picture of who humanity is, made by God rather than living this kind of life of self-invention, which is how I lived. And it was just so profoundly compelling to me. A few months later, I immigrated right from the UK over to the United States. I moved to Tallahassee, and one of my friends, a new faculty member at Florida State, like me, gave me C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And I remember reading that book, and Lewis, himself, of course, having gone from an atheist to a Christian, nothing had ever spoken to me like Mere Christianity. And then after reading that, one day I decided to rock up to church by myself on a Sunday morning. At this point, the other thing that's going on here is that part of this is, as I've told it, it's a really intellectual story, right, of deconstructing atheism and realizing just how incredibly compelling the story that the Bible tells us is. But there's also a very personal kind of element to all of this too, which is that I also realized I'd been kind of living this life of self-fulfillment, which is very much the way that we live these days, where we think about the good life as kind of relentless self-invention and self-creation. And the more I lived like that, the more I realized that no matter how much I had, and I had so much, achieved these kind of childhood dreams of Oxford and Cambridge and so forth, and it left me empty. And so when I rocked up to church that Sunday morning in Tallahassee, there was both this kind of intellectual yearning, but also this kind of spiritual yearning too, because there was a sense that this kind of life of self-discovery and a life completely rootless, right? And I think this is where me being a historian comes in too, right? There's a yearning for some kind of rootedness, some kind of groundedness outside of myself, both I think in time, but also in the sacred, which is also something I'd always dismissed as an atheist. And I went to church that Sunday morning and they celebrated the Lord's Supper. And I'd never been baptized as a child, of course, no non-Christian parents. So I just kind of sat in the pews and I'm listening to this ancient liturgy of the Lord's Supper with biblical words of Christ talking about, pouring out his blood for people and for the forgiveness of sins. And I guess that was probably the last kind of pivotal moment, to be honest, because that took me into a place in which I actually got quite emotional at that moment, sort of privately in the pews, because I actually felt that I'd been running from God my entire life and that I was a profoundly broken person, that actually the Bible's story of sin was deeply true about not only the world, but about who I was, and that this offer that God had to draw me back to himself and to love me and to ground me in his love, which is outside of myself and in his people, his historical people outside of myself, was something that was just so profoundly compelling. So a few months later, this point, like in my late 20s, I sat in my apartment in Tallahassee in a closet, like literally, a closet, a walk-in. In Australia, this is quite funny because we call them a wardrobe. We call it a closet in America. So I sat in my closet and I remember praying that sinner's prayer actually, and giving my life to Christ. Yeah.